Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this The Life of X. Melvin, how are you?
I'm good. Good. It's been an hour.
It has been about an hour, and currently Cleveland Cavaliers fighting for survival in the NBA playoffs.
Yeah.
Against the Indiana Pacers.
If any of us sound distracted, you know why.
No, we are 100% locked in.
All in, just like you should be.
That's right. Anyway, we're here for part 2 of our Bruce Lee series.
The R. That's Chinese.
I didn't know that. I actually didn't hear what you said. But anyway, when we last left off, we'd covered Bruce Lee's early life in Hong Kong, and we are right up to the point where he has taken a 3-week-long voyage to the United States to claim his United States citizenship before his 18th birthday.
Yeah, so we left off with Bruce leaving Hong Kong. Now, he's coming to the United States thinking, you know what, I can earn a little money on the side teaching cha-cha and teaching kung fu, but, you know, in terms of his education goals, he thought he was going to become a dentist or a doctor.
Which is hilarious when you consider how bad he was at school.
Right, like, I can barely deal with high school / college in Hong Kong, but I'm going to show up in the States and just knock out this dental school or med school.
Yeah.
And it's also just interesting to think about Bruce Lee being
your dentist.
Right. But yeah, so he shows up in the United States, and initially he's living in San Francisco. And I think he just stays there for a few months, and he's just kind of...
Until he runs out of money. Because if I recall correctly, his parents sent him to the States with like $1,500.
Yeah.
Even back then, I don't think that would last you too long.
That moved pretty quick. And he was joined for a short period of time by his brother, Peter. And his brother, Peter, was on his way to the University of Wisconsin. And I think he actually gets like a medical degree. Maybe. Don't quote me on that.
Hey, those Lee children, smart cookies. Bruce just not good at school.
So, he's in San Francisco for a little while, but he runs out of money and he needs to find a new place to stay. And that's when they lean on some old family friends. His family knew a woman that lived in Seattle named Ruby Chow. And Ruby Chow was basically, I'd call it like the mother away from home,
Yeah, and it seemed like she kind of played that role for a lot of people. Because like my understanding was that she ran a restaurant. It was kind of a big deal, her restaurant, because it was outside of Chinatown. And, you know, when she was opening this place up, people were like, oh, no one's ever going to come out to your restaurant outside of Chinatown, blah, blah, blah. But it was really successful. She had a lot of traffic through there. And so whenever people were trying to get their roots settled down in the U.S., they could stay with her and work for her at her restaurant for a while. And that's sort of what Bruce went to do, except that Bruce was just about as bad at being a waiter as he was at school.
Yeah, so Bruce was a pretty strong personality, and he did not take to like the structure and being like an employee all that well. And it's kind of interesting because Ruby was the landing spot, you know, the springboard for a lot of people a lot of Chinese that are just arriving in the United States. But she doesn't remember Bruce fondly. She actually was pretty negative on Bruce. I'll quote her what she says, what Bruce Thomas quotes her as saying in the book. She says, "I took care of him for 4 years. I raised 5 children and treated him like a second son. He was just not the sort of person you would want your children to grow up and be like. He was wild and undisciplined. He had no respect for anyone. Lots of martial arts people are insecure. Martial arts are supposed to be used to defend people, but he used them to be aggressive. Did he get any better as he got older? I don't think so." Ruby was not
the biggest Bruce Lee fan.
Not the biggest Bruce Lee fan. So, I mean, obviously he worked for her for a while and, she didn't appreciate. Well, she just didn't. She didn't appreciate his personality.
Well, personality, probably wasn't the best for being like an employee, but also he was young. We've already discussed the fact that he was very aggressive. He also, I think, when he heard about this arrangement from his mother, who kind of pulled the strings with Ruby, thought that he was going to be like a house guest.
Yeah.
At first. And so, he shows up and he's got this tiny little room, barely enough room for him to lay down and sleep in. And then he's got to work, earn his keep.
Yeah, he's legit like an indentured servant.
Yeah, like, and like at the time he's also attending like a technical school, I guess in preparation to try to go to college and
yeah,
that sort of
he had
thing.
to do like, when he arrived, he kind of had to like go back to high school.
Yeah.
He had to pretty much finish American high school, and he ended up at this place called Edison High, where he kind of did a lot of, work to get him ready for college in the United States. But it was also during this time at Ruby Child's that he starts taking on a small number of students. He would teach these guys in the parking lot.
It was during the time he was working at Ruby Chow's that he gave his first, or at least the first Kung Fu demonstration that he gave in Seattle. And it was at like an Asian culture day.
Yeah, it seemed like initially when he was in Seattle, he would just, he would get kind of recruited to go to these sort of like cultural events. And, they'd always have people that like demonstrate, some sort of Chinese art. And he would be there and he would show some Kung Fu.
How was Bruce as a teacher?
As a Kung Fu teacher?
Yeah, and especially in those early days.
Bruce probably he lacked patience.
Hard. He lacked all the patience.
And this is the problem that, we always talk about with people who are really good at stuff. Sometimes we say the best NBA players don't make the best coaches.
You can't learn from the greats.
Because they look at you like, dude, why can't you do this? This is easy. And I think Bruce had a bit of that quality to him where he's like, listen, man, I'm not going to I can't show you the same punch like 15 times. Like, you need to, like, when I snap it out there, you need to get it.
Look, man, I already showed you this once.
Right. So, I mean, with Bruce, you had to learn pretty quick, especially in those early days.
Yeah, and another thing, not only was he impatient, but that explosive temper was there. And there's more than one account throughout his time as a teacher of someone slipping in a quote unquote lucky punch.
And him just going off.
And Bruce
and putting people down, which we'll talk about with one of his closer students. Yeah, one of his best friends. It's a really interesting story. And, Bruce he's settling into the U.S., but it's been hard on him. Obviously, he's dealing with being an immigrant in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, actually. And he's dealing with racial discrimination, and he would take like any sort of affront, man. He was 0 to 100.
He was ready to go.
Yeah. So, that's Bruce at the time, and he starts to date around, he's settling in. There was a girl that he dated named Amy Sambo. According to Bruce Thomas, there were certain aspects of Bruce's personality that she was not fond of. Like, she thought he was, kind of chauvinistic, a show off. She just wasn't all that into Bruce. Like, basically, there were just things that she couldn't deal with. And Bruce, though, seemed to be all in on her. He actually ends up proposing to her on numerous occasions, like at least twice. She turns him down on both occasions and runs off to New York.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of this has to do with the fact that Bruce came to the United States to, like, quote unquote, make something of himself. He was planning on going back to Hong Kong, visiting and that sort of thing. And he probably wanted to be able to, like, show his family, like, hey, I'm, progressing in life. But Amy was like, you're not progressing with me.
Right. Marriage wasn't in the cards, at least for that moment. But, in terms of progress in life, like he did earn his high school diploma from Edison High, and he did well enough to secure a spot at the University of Washington in 1961.
Yeah, and it was also around this time that Bruce starts making friends who were also his students with people who would be lifelong friends. And, he ran afoul of them every once in a while, but they were his circle for the most part. And, some of their names, just to throw them out there now, because I'm sure we'll mention them later. Or
Taki Kimura.
Kimura, you had Jesse Glover, Jim DeMille, Ed Hart, Dan Inosanto, and you had like Doug Palmer. And a lot of these guys were other martial arts practitioners who had either seen Bruce in a demonstration or heard about Bruce. And it was like, oh, hey, like there's this guy running around Seattle doing these demonstrations of this martial art that none of us have ever seen before. And
that's an important thing to point out, is that outside of like, the Chinatowns and things like that in the United States, like Kung Fu wasn't a known commodity. In fact, karate, which is, at the time was much more well known, was a recent import to the United States. And that kind of came out of that post-war.
Yeah, with soldiers stationed in
Japan and coming back. I mean, really, in a lot of ways, there wasn't as much known about East Asia as obviously today. So like Kung Fu was this mystery, man.
Yeah.
And people were like, this guy is doing something, like it's cool, but it's not like anything
and again,
that we've ever seen.
It's important to mention, I think, that Bruce is a very small person. And so when he gives his demonstration and moving people across vast distances as a very small and slight man, it's like, I need to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, Bruce is, he's around probably 140 pounds, if that.
You Google image of Bruce Lee and like you see a jacked man, but this was before then.
This was before that. And one thing that's interesting, obviously we based all of this on Bruce Thomas's biography, but I have other books.
Melvin's personal library.
So there's like 3 books. But a guy named John Little edited a bunch of books on Bruce Lee. And I took a look at those, and I looked at one of Bruce Lee's cards that he has scanned into the book, and it's kind of like when he started working out, and he had his weight listed at like 140 or like 144 or something like that. I think, he gets down ultimately to like 132, 134 after he starts like really training, but he's not a huge dude.
No.
And the other thing too to remember is that this is before Bruce started training a lot, but this is the thing to remember is like, this is before people were really into weightlifting. Weightlifting was a weird out there thing. Like
if you did this, you were like lifting strangely shaped iron weights. Like you were a strong man, or like this was before like the
and it wasn't like little people lifting weights, what I mean? And like one thing that's weird is that like just the whole act of weightlifting wasn't a thing, and the fact that like a lot of the machines didn't even exist.
No.
So
you just get into weight.
Right, we'll get into it more later, but weightlifting in the United States wasn't as developed at this time as it obviously would become today. But at this time, Bruce is doing his Kung Fu thing, and he's doing demonstrations around Seattle, and he actually gives one demonstration at Garfield High. And there's one person, in the crowd that we'll come back and talk about a little later. Her name was Linda Cadwell. But this young lady took a little bit of a liking to Bruce, and their paths would cross again a little bit later.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, one of her friends was one of Bruce's students.
Yeah, ultimately in the end when they get to college. But at this point, she's just
you're right. This was before that.
She's just recognized, hey, there's this
she was in high school then.
Yeah, she was in high school. I think Bruce was about Garfield. 3 years older. Bruce had already started school at the University of Washington.
Yeah, and before we get into Bruce's life after he started at University of Washington, I do want to real quick stop and talk about this particular moment in Bruce's life that, according to Bruce Thomas, was very important, and according to other people.
If you watch the movie, it stands out. It's
kind of one of those things that I'm kind of skeptic. I don't think that this was probably that formative of a moment, but it's one of those things that has kind of become like in the lore of Bruce Lee.
Yeah. So like that lore is that obviously Bruce battled demons, and really it's kind of a particular
the shadow.
The shadow. And this actually stretches back to when he was born with like the family trying to confuse the spirits.
The curse.
And, people have played up on that. And so like when he's living with Ruby Chow, he has this like nightmare where he's like fighting this shadow.
We should mention he was always a restless sleeper.
Yeah. And Bruce Thomas describes it as this kind of like shadowy figure that holds him down. And trying to fight back against this shadowy figure, he wakes up just covered in sweat from battling this demon. And this is where Bruce Thomas gets into this kind of discussion about Bruce battling creating all this positive energy and these negative energies. And if that's your thing, then it's one explanation. But, I think from what it sounds like initially, from what Bruce Thomas talks about is...
It was sleep paralysis.
Sleep paralysis, right? And this is a thing that obviously happens everywhere. Different cultures have different ways of referring to it. And
even like early accounts of what sleep paralysis was when people didn't necessarily understand. I'm talking about like medieval explanations. It was referred to like as you have like a demon sleeping on your chest or whatever. And those of you who aren't familiar with what sleep paralysis is, it's very jarring. And my understanding of it is more or less that your mind or your brain sort of wakes up before your body does.
Yeah, so there's a function of your body that's basically your brain kind of like cuts the cord to the rest of your body to stop you from acting out your dreams. And what happens is your brain becomes active before it like re-engages that part of your body. And a lot of people that like when you're starting to wake up, you have this like, I can't move.
Yeah.
And a lot of people when they have this, it's accompanied with like a nightmare.
Yeah.
So like there's a demon or a witch that sits on your chest.
Or is like standing in the corner watching you.
Yeah, and you can't move. This has become a central part of Bruce Lee lore, and Bruce Thomas talks about this as kind of really sparking this kind of drive for self-improvement while he's living with Ruby Chow.
He graduated from high school. He started at Washington. He also got into self-help books and that sort of stuff too.
So one thing that's interesting is when he starts at Washington, he kind of, I feel like this is a very Bruce Lee thing to do, but he's like, I'm going to take classes that I think are just interesting to me. He wasn't really on the program. So when he first gets to Washington, he enrolls in gymnastics and wrestling.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting because if you talk, obviously talk of Bruce Lee moves around the like fighting world nowadays, like the MMA circles, and guys, talk about like Bruce, he couldn't fight on the ground and things like that. And really, if you read, into Bruce and you read all of the writings that he had about fighting, I think they'd be shocked to find out like Bruce Lee studied wrestling.
And another thing too is that we've talked about how Bruce had started teaching people kung fu and stuff like that, but by no means was he done learning. Even while he was training people from other backgrounds, and he would want to learn their moves just like he was teaching them. And he would also travel to different gyms and different martial arts schools to absorb as much as he could and to ask questions of the masters there and sometimes challenge them, which they didn't love. But
yeah, so this is where he really starts to break into that, like, it's about practicality.
Yeah.
It's about how useful is this technique. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk more about this later, but he was really beginning to question the traditional martial arts at this time. And this starts while he's in college. And he actually gets into like this scuffle with a karate practitioner who they just refer to in the book as Ouchi or Uechi. I don't know. I can't remember the name. But he roughs this guy up. And the guy basically was upset with Bruce because he was kind of saying these things that didn't jive with karate practice.
Yeah.
And the guy kept interrupting Bruce. So Bruce just decided like, all right, we're going to go to the gym and I'm going to beat you up. And that's what he did.
And one thing that we didn't mention too that I think at least we should give a quick mention is that the people that he was teaching were from all different backgrounds, not like martial arts, obviously, but also racially and that sort of thing. Like there was, he had like white students, but he had a lot of like different minority students too. And my main point was that they weren't Chinese. And that was a big break from the tradition that he had grown up in, wherein this was not something that you were to teach to outsiders. And so that was one thing that he was always like mindful of whenever he, wrote back home or whatever. He never mentioned that he was teaching non-Chinese.
Yeah. And speaking of that, so Bruce actually returns to Hong Kong in 1963. And when he does, he brings one of his buddies with him. And this buddy is actually one of the people that Bruce had been teaching. His name was Doug Palmer. So Doug goes back to Hong Kong with Bruce, and Bruce apparently was not fond of the cops, like I guess any old street tough wouldn't be. So they'd play jokes on some of the police officers. Like one of them, like they wore a special badge, some of them that indicated that they could speak English, but they really couldn't speak English very well half the time. So like Doug would go up and just start saying stuff to them, and then he would ask for a road that didn't exist. And the guy would be like, what? Huh? Then after Doug would kind of get upset with them, like Bruce would show up and it's like, oh, you're going over here? Yeah, let me show you where that is. And like, leave the cop there scratching his...
Completely confused.
Yeah. And some other interesting things happen while he's in Hong Kong. His father, while he's in Hong Kong, just decides like, you're a man now, like, it's time for you to get circumcised.
Time to get nicked.
His buddy Doug's like, that was surprising. And what's also surprising about it is that Bruce was like, yeah, sure.
Bruce Thomas gives an alarmingly detailed account.
Of the like days and weeks after like getting this done of Bruce like walking funny and not being able to like kick or stuff like that.
Wearing much looser pants than he was accustomed to.
Oh, yeah. And another interesting thing that happened during this time was obviously Bruce is a newly minted United States citizen. And, you know, it was like a slow ramp up for the United States getting involved in the Vietnam War. And somehow Bruce found himself on the draft rolls, right?
Yeah.
So he gets drafted first, but then he's deemed ineligible. Do you remember why he couldn't?
No.
An undescended testicle.
Strange.
And you can tell this was the early days of the Vietnam War, because I bet you somebody would have looked the other way if this was like much later. If this was 1968, and be like,
he's
69,
fine.
Yeah, you're good to go. Stamp that. So, yeah, he was almost drafted. He dodged that bullet, literally and figuratively.
And I think real quick we should talk about Bruce's relationship with his father.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that yet.
No, and I feel like, and again, this depends on when we release this episode, but running theme with, not all, but it seems like many of our topics is a father that I would be glad not to have in my life. But
really,
but with some of them, like I'm thinking.
Well, no. I'm thinking about Bruce's father.
Oh no, that's what I was going to say. That's not necessarily the case with Bruce. He also wasn't the Paul Jobs. You know what I mean? He wasn't the super supportive, warm, loving, outwardly loving, I should say, father figure. And Thomas talks a lot about how that's normal in terms of the culture, but I just thought it was important to mention.
So Bruce's relationship with his father seems to be more in that what I would call like the traditional Chinese like father-son.
The father was supposed to be like respected and not necessarily.
It was like there's a lot of love between these two, but as the father, I'm never gonna show it, and as a son, like you're not gonna see it. So like, I mean, the crazy thing is like the sons, in Chinese society, oftentimes traditional Chinese society are like the world, but the father is not like, it's not supposed to be like a doting father. And I think their relationship, and obviously we're speaking very generally about China, and it's a rapidly changing society today. But basically Thomas's explanation fits that mold. When Bruce left for the United States, his dad's like, "Yeah, okay, I'm not gonna come out and drive you to the airport and like give you a big hug." But I think from the Western standpoint, looking at it, it seems very cold and distant. Speaking from my own experience, I had one of my good friends growing up, Chinese guy. He moved to the United States when he was like 9, but like his dad was not a doting father that just, hung all over him. I mean, I rarely recall ever seeing his dad even like speak. Yeah, it's definitely a different kind of relationship. I guess maybe that's part of the reason why, like, when your dad shows up and says, "Time to get circumcised,"
he's just like, "All right,
let's do it." So, yeah, I mean, that was his trip in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and I also think it's not necessarily significant, but he went to visit Yip Man while he was there, and he made a point of making sure that Doug didn't show that he knew anything. And I actually don't think he was even permitted to come inside when they went to see Yip Man.
Yeah, like they would go there, and I think Doug ends up watching somehow. But like Bruce made sure it's like, dude, do not indicate that I've been teaching you kung fu. Like, don't do it. And an interesting thing to note is like Doug had been studying Mandarin at this point in time, which is kind of remarkable given the time period. But that didn't help him when he was in Hong Kong, because obviously they're speaking Cantonese, but he's still, he's in a Chinese setting and comes to watch Ip Man practice, and like Ip would have been really upset if he had
any notion that Bruce had been teaching.
And now that we're talking about Ip Man, just to mention, because now I'm remembering why they're spelled differently. Bruce Thomas is using an older way of Romanizing the name, so that's the difference. The difference is just how they Romanized it. So now with like pinyin, they use IP. I think, actually, I don't even know. That's probably wrong.
All right.
But whatever.
Cool, we're leaving it in there so everyone can make fun of you. Everyone can make fun of you for being wrong.
But when Bruce returns, this is when love is in the air, and he re-meets the woman that would be his wife for the rest of his life, man.
Linda is also kind of his most staunch defender of like his legacy now, or at least was in the years following his death. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. And as I kind of jumped the gun earlier and mentioned, she meets Bruce because one of her friends at the University of Washington was a student of his, and she was like, "Hey, just come and meet my teacher." Because Bruce is a college student too, and so he's teaching these people, but they're his friends as well, and they would all train together, and then they would hang out and that sort of stuff. And it gets kind of the point where Bruce is like, "Hey, maybe you and me should go get some dinner or something like that sometime without everybody."
Right, just slide that on in there, like
just slide in the DMs.
I mean, which is kind of interesting too, because I remember in Thomas's account, he's like, "Yeah, Linda was like, sure, I'll go like check out this kung fu thing. Like, I'll probably go to like 1, maybe 2 classes." And, she gets hooked. And,
she's like, "Oh, this instructor is fine."
Yeah. She's like, "I remember him." from high school. Yeah, he's a good-looking guy. And this is actually right around the time that Bruce moves out from Ruby Chow's place, and he opens up his first martial arts school in October of 1963 called the Junfan Kung Fu Institute. And this was at 4750 University Way, just a little ways from the University of Washington.
And it was very like a nondescript building. You would have never known what was going on inside if you'd walked past. Right.
And he's also, I mean, the other side is like he's living in this building.
For
like
sure.
This was his school and his apartment.
Yeah.
And it was apparently, sparsely furnished. But, to make ends meet, man, Bruce is charging $4 a week from his pupils.
That's so funny.
Yeah, I know. Now it's like, man, he's living literally. Like when you can charge $4 a week for anything and generate enough money to live. But hey.
But I mean, also think about the fact that like for $4 a week, $16 a month, you can learn from perhaps the greatest martial artist of all time.
Yeah, it's really crazy to think about nowadays. But one thing that's also important to point out is like right now he's starting to question like traditional styles.
But he's mostly teaching.
He's teaching, Kung Fu. His brand of it, but that's what he's teaching. And, if you want to take this up, but stuff starts moving quickly with Linda.
Yeah. And also, quick side note, shortly after he opened up that first school was when he first performed at another Garfield High School demonstration, the now famous 1-inch punch. And
first time, yeah.
I thought it was a cool description because he was just like, I need to find the biggest guy in here. And the guy's like bracing himself for it. And Bruce just seemingly without barely moving, knocks him back.
Yeah, and I remember, Bruce Thomas talks about like, this was actually at a fairly tough school, it was kind of in the city, I want to say. And like, there's a lot of kids who are like, yeah, whatever. Like some dude's going to come in and do something. Yeah, whatever. And he did the 1-inch punch in part to like get their attention. Yeah. It was like, yo, okay, this guy, he's doing something because, Big Tommy over there has never been knocked down. So yeah, I mean, that's when he throws that first 1-inch punch. Now this, we don't obviously have any footage of. We just have someone who would eventually become his, one of his pupils, I think. Yeah. Talk about it.
But like Melvin said, now things are getting more serious with Linda, and there were a few issues in the relationship, mostly generated by her parents who didn't like Chinese people. And I think actually it was just her mother. Now that I think about it, I don't know that her father was around because
he doesn't get mentioned.
Yeah, it seems like every time like the issues come up, it was always Linda's mother.
Only like male I think that gets mentioned in this in terms of her family is like an uncle.
Yeah.
But, Bruce ends up proposing to Linda, and one thing happens, and they end up getting married. But they don't tell anyone that they're going to get married. Do you remember how
No, I think they got engaged. I don't think they actually got married, but I think it was like the wedding announcement because they were engaged to be married.
Yeah.
Because they were just going to hide it, and it comes out in the newspaper, and one of her relatives recognizes her name and asks
her aunt.
Yeah, it was her aunt, and she was like, "Where's my invitation to this wedding?"
Right. So back in those days in Washington, the marriages had to be published in the paper.
Yeah.
So when they announced that they were going to get married, the announcement was published in the paper. And obviously, Linda's aunt's like, oh, yeah, reading through like, who's just randomly reading through the marriages that are going to be happening around town?
It was 1963.
Good point.
Also, I think it's important to say that Linda's mother had some racially motivated reasons for not wanting her daughter to be with Bruce. But also at the same time, Bruce was also like not necessarily what you would consider like an eligible bachelor. He was a guy without any sort of consistent income, living in his gym. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, so even if he hadn't been Chinese, which bothered Linda's mother, she probably wouldn't have been pumped about them getting together.
So that was like the kind of discussion, like, in the movie and in this book, it's very much so presented that it's like, listen, you can't marry a Chinese guy, which I have no doubts in my mind that they were highly concerned about that. And they say Taki Kimura, one of his buddies, kind of paints a slightly different picture. He's like, man, they were just concerned about the fact that their daughter's getting ready to marry a guy with no income, like no meaningful income. Yeah. And, just the regular things. But Thomas, kind of explains that away and says that Kimura was often a target of like racial discrimination. So he saw things. Maybe he had a little thicker skin. But Bruce, he shows up after they find out, and he kind of goes to her family, and he just says, listen, I want to marry your daughter.
And I'm Chinese.
And by the way, I'm Chinese. And that's pretty much how that played out. But
it was also kind of spurred along by the fact that by this time Linda was pregnant.
Right. So basically, it was one of those situations where now they're like, oh man, you pretty much just got to get in line with the fact that they're going to get married because Linda's pregnant. This is coming down the pipe. You just got to accept it.
I just imagine Bruce showing up and like, listen, my name's Bruce. I want to marry your daughter. And also, I'm Chinese. And also, Linda's pregnant.
So they fall in line, and they have actually a pretty quickly arranged wedding ceremony, which I think also rubbed Linda's mother the wrong way. They had to quickly get their dresses and suits together. I don't even know if they actually wore like.
Hey, because listen, they needed to get Linda married before she started showing.
Right.
That would be talk of the town.
And, basically her mom, the one thing that they leave in the book that her mother's saying, she's upset, like, man, Bruce could have at least brought flowers to the wedding ceremony. So, I mean, the way that I imagine it was a very bare bones wedding ceremony. But hey, they're married now.
They move in with one of Bruce's friends who we actually have not spoken about yet, but he was pretty much Bruce's best friend. Yeah. Now,
was this guy, he was like a family friend, right? Like, almost like a Ruby Chow, I think.
I believe so. His name was James Lee, and he and Linda move in with James and James's wife, who actually passes away shortly after they move in together, and also James's daughter. But he was another person who would practice martial arts with Bruce, but he also influenced Bruce a lot in that he had been into weightlifting early on. He was really into physical training, and he was also a welder. And so when Bruce got really into physical training and strength training and all that sort of stuff, he called on James a lot to build him equipment. So like now, you walk into a gym, you've got all these specialized bars and all these machines and super specific stuff. But at the time they didn't have that. It was like, here's a weight, lift it up. And Bruce was like, no, like I need very specific things because I'm trying to improve very specific things. And the stuff didn't exist. And Bruce, being like a kinesthetic genius, pretty much, he would sketch up what he wanted and he would take it to James and he would weld it up.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we should note that James is 20 years older than Bruce. So I mean, I think they're best friends, but also James kind of becomes like almost like a father figure, and more in the what I would call the Western sense, I guess. So yeah, like James was, as Eric mentioned, a weightlifting champion. He was also an amateur boxer, and he was practiced in judo. So he was bringing in also another different viewpoints on martial arts. And this was like a really important time for Bruce, but Bruce didn't necessarily take up like the conditioning initially. This happens when, as we mentioned before, Kung Fu wasn't something that was supposed to be taught to non-Chinese. It was basically like, listen, this is like a self-defense secret that we have. You should not let this out. And when word finally got out that Bruce had been teaching non-Chinese people Kung Fu, this was not accepted well in the Oakland Chinese community, which is where they were.
We should mention, too, that Bruce had opened a second school in Oakland. And so, like Melvin said, word gets out, people take exception. People are also looking to make a name for themselves. Yeah. This was not, again, I think we've touched on this before, but this is not the time when you could learn martial arts on every corner. These teachers had reputations, and, that's how they get students in a lot of cases. And so this one now famous fight with
Wong Jack Man.
Yeah, Wong Jack Man in early 1965 is kind of become a legend.
The legendary fight.
Yeah, and what happens is he shows up and he's like, my style versus yours, and loser shuts down their gym and can no longer teach. And it really, from Bruce Thomas's description, it wasn't a close fight at all. Bruce really beat him up, but he was really distraught over his performance because it took him, in his opinion, far too long to finish off Man. And also he was extremely tired by the end of it. And he was like, that was a relatively short fight with someone who I was clearly better than, and against one guy. Like, what if these things had been different? Like, how would I have survived?
Yeah, Bruce really struggled with that situation. Like, I can't remember if he was just challenged by like Wong Jack Man, or Wong Jack Man was the guy that, like, the champion that they brought in to take down Bruce. But in Bruce's mind, like, fights are, he's about efficiency.
Yeah. And
in his mind, like, the fights don't take long.
No,
like,
fights should take seconds.
They're over.
Yeah.
And basically a lot of the descriptions, there's been different accounts of what happened, but I think Linda gives an account of what happened. And it basically consisted of, their first like clash, and like Wong Jack Man's like, oh crap, like I can't deal with this guy. And, supposedly he spends most of the time literally chasing Wong Jack Man around this room.
Hitting him in the back of the head.
And punching him in the back of the head. Which, if anyone knows, like, you don't want to punch people in the back of the head. Heads are hard.
Yeah.
And that hurts.
And finger bones are small and dainty.
Yeah. And so, like, Bruce, after, like, he finally beats the dude, and he's just exhausted.
And his hands hurt.
And this is the point where he realizes, man, physical conditioning is really important. And this, I think, was brought to him by James Lee. James is like, listen, man, like, you want to be better, you need to start training vigorously.
Yeah.
And that's when he gets into the kind of legendary Bruce Lee conditioning programs. He started every morning with a run. And I think usually like the runs were up to like maybe 6 miles initially. And, he would do a mid-afternoon run. If he wasn't going to do the mid-afternoon run, he'd do an hour on the exercise bike. He starts doing these different exercises to develop different parts of his body. And, he would just do it all day. If he was sitting there watching TV, he was watching TV doing bicep curls.
It's hard to overstate how obsessive Bruce was when he got his mind onto something. He was 100% one-track mind when it came to, and, in this case, physical improvement, and in other cases, just improving his martial art.
And if you're interested in kind of seeing exactly the program that Bruce Lee went on, you're not going to necessarily find it in Thomas's documentary, but Thomas's biography. But you can check out the edited books by John Little. You can look at the book Jeet Kune Do, and then he has another one that's called The Art of Expressing the Human Body, which has the full workout plans, everything. And you can learn a lot about kind of Bruce's mindset when it came to working out. You got to understand, like we were mentioning, weightlifting was relatively new at the time, and Bruce was really inspired by the Yale swim team. The coaches on the Yale swim team were like...
Jacked and tan.
Nah, they were Jack Tan and Juicy. No, they realized that they had a hunch. They were like, man, like I bet you if our swimmers like strength train, maybe they'll do better because the resistance that they're getting in the water is only so much. They're only going to develop muscles so much. So let's give them some more resistance outside of the water. And obviously, as we know today, the results went past their expectations. They noticed that like, oh, dude, these guys are way faster now when they hit the water. So I mean, that's when you start to have that idea of like, okay, strength training. Really like rigorous strength training and organized strength training is going to produce better results for athletic performance. And Bruce started devouring weightlifting magazines around that time.
And books and any book that he could find on it.
And, this just adds to the list of stuff he's reading because he's reading voraciously about all different kinds of martial arts styles. He's studying wrestling
and philosophy,
judo,
we
philosophy.
We didn't mention that he was pursuing
a philosophy degree.
Yeah, that he was at least, I don't know if he was actually enrolled in a program. but he was thinking about at least a philosophy PhD.
Yeah. Ultimately, he doesn't really finish college, I don't think.
No, he stopped that shortly before his marriage.
He's well read. He's reading a lot of stuff. And he really, in terms of the weightlifting, a few things that he gets into is he gets into isometric training, which was big at the time. There's a lot of proponents, but it kind of took a hit after, it found out that a lot of its proponents were using steroids.
Yeah.
But for those that don't know, isometric training is basically resistance training, but there's actually no movement. So basically you strain against the weight that you cannot move. And you'll hold that contraction for like a minute or however long you can hold it. And it had a bad rap for a while, but it's actually a fairly effective weightlifting technique that you can include into your program. He also really started working on circuit training, aerobic circuit training and weightlifting training. And he was focused a lot of his lifts on compound exercises.
Bruce was the first CrossFitter.
Legitimately, if you think about it, a lot of this stuff is stuff that's kind of big today. Mm-hmm. People always talk about you really want to build like strength and explosiveness, you go to compound exercises. Like you don't do isolation exercises. And it's wild to think that this guy in the 1960s was putting all of this together, doing this. And the other flip side that's even crazier is now he's like a health nut. You got to remember, this is before you go out to GNC and get a protein shake. This dude is mixing up protein shakes with like raw eggs and beef. And doing all gross. And royal jelly. Basically do it at home like GNC stuff. And it's crazy to think that he's doing this literally decades before all these guys. And one thing that's really good about his personality and the way he approached things was that it's trial and error. Like if it doesn't work, he's just like, all right, like I'm done with it. And through all this, he just builds a phenomenal body. So like he's on the cutting edge. I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about it and just like glowing about his physique. And if you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger talking about your biceps, like you're doing something right. So he just builds a phenomenal physique and it starts to really improve his martial arts training. But this leads into kind of his big break.
We really haven't mentioned it a lot or at all, actually. I don't think that Bruce, even though he was pursuing teaching and that sort of stuff, he really wanted to get into action films in the United States, or I don't even know if I should say action films because I don't even know if it was really a defined genre at that point.
Yeah, just acting. I'd say.
Yeah, he wanted to get into acting, but it was not going to be easy for him to go the traditional route because it's still not super common to have like a minority lead in a movie. I mean, it's obviously a lot more common nowadays than it was in the 60s, but at the time to even suggest that a Chinese man could carry a film or whatever was just like unheard of in Hollywood. And so he really started to pursue breaking into the industry through his abilities in martial arts. And his break into TV and film starts with a demonstration at the Long Beach Sports International Karate Tournament.
Yeah, so this tournament, I think it took place in 1964. And this was where a really big audience of important people saw Bruce Lee do his thing. He put on a number of demonstrations there.
Including
one of
the
the
one-inch
things, the
punch.
1-inch punch, which, you can go on YouTube and find, and, he'll 1-inch punch somebody and they'll fall into the chair and the chair will slide back. And he did some demonstrations with some of the students, some light sparring. And, if you watch the videos of the demonstration, I mean, it's pretty impressive. You can read the YouTube comments and you start to see a lot of guys are like, but show me one time where he fought a fighter the quality of Bo Kao, who's a really ridiculous Muay Thai practitioner. But as you read Bruce's writings and things like that, because people often complain, like, obviously you have the people who just unabashedly worship Bruce Lee.
Yeah.
And then you have the people who are like, the man was nothing. He was an actor. And if you really look into Bruce Lee, like, fighting for sport never really seemed to factor into his...
No, he was all about what was useful.
All about what was useful, and not in a sports setting. I think there was a saying where, like, anytime you put on gloves, you're submitting to the rules, the confines of a sport competition. And I was reading some of the notes that he had that are in some of the edited stuff by John Little. And a lot of people think that, Bruce Lee never studied like jiu-jitsu or wrestling and things like that. Because a lot of them say, like, well, if you could just get him to the ground, then it's over.
Yeah.
And, the fact of the matter is he studied wrestling at the University of Washington. He studied judo, which, as we all know, has joint
that
locks.
armbar.
He studied jiu-jitsu. And the thing is, if you look at the notes, this is what's crazy. He'll write notes about different styles, and he'll say pros and cons. He'll say pros of wrestling, ground fighting. He says leg takedowns, which just, refers to like double and single leg takedowns, which are a, central component of mixed martial arts practice. And the thing that he says, so he'll look at wrestling and judo, he'll be like, great things about these: joint locks, choking. And it says, like, study those. But one thing that he'll note is, like, the problem with them is that they're sport. In one of his notes, underneath it, you see it says, needs to add eye gouging, groin grabbing. And that's kind of the way that he trained. You got to remember, he's a guy who grew up fighting on the streets in Hong Kong. So it's like, he trained sport fighters, but that wasn't the reason why he trained. And I remember the really interesting note about wrestling was that he said, really good, too many rules. Look up old wrestling techniques that are now illegal and learn those. His approach was very different. And this was starting to develop at this time.
And also, one thing about what Melvin was just saying about like sport in combat and that sort of stuff is that people often, especially if you're not super familiar with martial arts, they discount how much that affects the martial art. Like Melvin and I have both done a little bit of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you would be shocked at how much you use that mat or you use your gi, even if you're not necessarily holding the gi, but like, it makes it a whole heck of a lot easier to like move your body on the mat when you're wearing the gi than if you were wearing something else. And also that's part of the reason that Bruce didn't want his students to wear any kind of gi or any kind of uniform. He said, show up in your street clothes, because if you get attacked,
that's what you're going to be fighting.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially today, like mixed martial arts is the closest thing that we can have to a genuine fight.
Yeah.
But when you look at it and you really kind of understand it, there's probably a lot of MMA heads that are going to hate me for this, but it's very far from a genuine fight.
Yeah, like one of my favorite podcasts I listen to all the time is Jocko Willink's podcast, and he talks about this too. He's a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and he's well-versed in other martial arts, and he's always like, oh yeah, like you better believe that if I was in a fight, I wouldn't be going for like a spinning
I'm punching
leg
you
lock.
in the penis.
Well, yeah, he's like if I ended up on the ground, I wouldn't be going for any of these like fancy like leg locks and stuff. He's like, I'm
gonna heel hook you and we're out.
Right, he's like, I'd get on your back and choke you, and that would be that.
Yeah, that's the thing.
That's what Bruce was good at, was like, this is the effective stuff. I'm going to throw the rest of it out, and I'm going to drill the crap out of it.
A lot of people look at it and they say, oh man, well, it's just a demo. He doesn't know anything. Like, he was never in like a fight in the ring. If that's the kind of point that you're making, then you kind of don't really understand what he was trying to do. So, back to the Long Beach martial arts demo, he demos his stuff, does a 1-inch punch, and even meets his soon-to-be one of his close friends for life, Dan Inosanto, who was a Eskrima practitioner, Filipino guy, and he's not an easy one to impress. And Bruce managed to win him over, and this martial arts tournament would pay even bigger dividends about a year later, when he kind of gets his first big break and gets a screen test.
And actually, that screen test is where we're going to end up picking up next week when we come back. We are just about at time to wrap. So thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X Podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. You go through our Amazon portal. Any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.